We received a case that seemed routine, an elderly man found without complications. However, a small object on his clothing caught my attention. Upon thorough investigation, we discovered that this detail revealed the true sequence of events and prevented an error in the official interpretation. I learned that even what seems trivial can contain the truth, and that patience and respect for details make the difference between a correct and an incomplete report. When the body was handed over to me, I noticed that the victim, a man in his 70s, was dressed in a long-sleeved shirt and a light jacket, as if he had left home cautiously, anticipating a cool afternoon. At first glance, there were no signs of violence or apparent external injuries. It seemed like a typical case of natural death, probably some cardiac event or sudden collapse. But something made me pause. A small metal buckle, tiny and barely visible, was attached to the edge of the shirt, almost imperceptible beneath the jacket's lapel. It wasn't something common, not even a button or zipper. It was different, and for a fraction of a second, it captured my attention in an inexplicable way. That buckle, reflecting the white light of the laboratory, had an engraved symbol that I recognized instantly, a small, detailed emblem that reminded me of a medical insignia. What was curious was that the buckle did not correspond to the usual clothing style I had seen in people that age or socioeconomic condition in Guadalajara. The details seemed out of place, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit with the rest. What I would normally have dismissed, as it was too small and apparently irrelevant, now became the focus of my attention. While I examined the clothing more carefully, the team with me was ready to begin the routine procedure: autopsy, organ extraction, fluid analysis, and all the corresponding protocol for a body without signs of external violence. But I insisted on preserving that buckle intact because I sensed it might hold more than it appeared. Perhaps due to a hunch or years of experience collecting clues from the mundane, I didn't want to rush past something that could be crucial. The first hours were slow. I observed every detail of the body with patient care. There were no bruises, no closed or open wounds, no obvious traces of toxic substances, nor external skin changes that could explain the cause of death. The initial autopsy pointed to natural death, possibly cardiac or cerebral failure, as the provisional medical history sent what the body suggested. Beyond that small buckle, everything indicated an ordinary case. However, my instinct led me to request a more detailed analysis of the lung and heart tissue. Something about the way the victim was positioned, the stiffness of his joints, and the absence of foam or pronounced moisture in the airways made me suspicious. When I opened the jacket's inner pocket, I found something that had initially gone unnoticed in the first police report. Tiny printed photographs, barely visible to the naked eye, as if taken with a very old camera. I couldn't clearly make out what they showed, but with a magnifying glass we were able to see some blurry images of a group of people, apparently in a confrontation or discussion, and a man who seemed to be holding something in his hands, something that looked like a document or a letter. That man, by posture and facial details, bore an unsettling resemblance to the victim. I wondered if those images could be some kind of hidden evidence, perhaps a sentimental record, or, on the other hand, an unknown background. Things began to get stranger when, during the scene and belongings inspection, the deceased family informed us that the victim had been involved in a conflict with a neighbor weeks before dying, related to disputes over property. It was a sensitive matter, involving complex legal differences and rumors of threats. This information completely contradicted the initial official version, which simply stated that the man had died of natural causes. With this new information, I decided to order a thorough toxicological exam to look for any exogenous substance that could have contributed to death or revealed inadvertent poisoning. The family, although grieving, seemed eager for the truth. They insisted that their loved one had no enemies or serious health problems, which made everything even more puzzling. The lab results took time to arrive, but when they did, they were as revealing as they were unexpected. There were no traces of poison or conventional drugs, but we did detect an uncommon substance, a type of chemical compound used in certain industrial pesticides, known for causing progressive damage to the nervous and cardiovascular systems. This led me to think that the death had not been spontaneous, but could have resulted from prolonged exposure or even an act of sabotage. Pressure was mounting. I began to think about how that small buckle might be linked to all of this. I recalled that the engraved symbol belonged to a group of medical volunteers who, in some old communities, helped control infestations in agricultural fields. I wondered if that buckle could have been a kind of service insignia or possession of someone with access to those pesticides. When we traced the origin of the clothing, we found that the garment had been purchased not locally, but in the neighboring municipality, a place known for labor controversies between peasants and farm administrators. Digging deeper, we learned that the neighbor involved in the dispute had worked on a nearby ranch where those pesticides were applied. Our initial hypothesis began to make sense. The man, unknowingly, might have been an indirect victim of manipulation or a toxic environment that resulted in his death, apparently disguised as natural. All this forced us to reopen the police investigation that was already closing the case. We contacted experts in environmental toxicology, lawyers, and community representatives to understand if there had been previous complaints about contamination or similar cases in the area. I was impressed to learn that, in fact, there were unofficial reports of ongoing problems with these types of chemicals, but they were always ignored or silenced since they concerned elderly people, humble peasants whose voices did not reach federal or state authorities. Every new detail brought us closer to the hidden truth behind what seemed like a simple death due to old age. The body before my eyes held testimonies not found in classic medical reports, nor in superficial interviews. The buckle and the photographs were just the tip of a much darker and broader iceberg involving negligence, information concealment, and perhaps acts of social injustice. For a moment, alone in the laboratory, I wonder how many other cases have been lost amid indifference and appearances. How many times natural death was a disguise for painful realities invisible to those who only look superficially. This case made me aware of the responsibility placed upon us, forensic doctors, not only to certify a cause, but to seek the truth, no matter how small, because the lives and stories we represent deserve to be heard in their entirety. We decided to deliver our report along with the evidence and conclusions to local and federal authorities, emphasizing the need to review the environmental conditions of the area and the social context that could be affecting the health of the vulnerable population. I also suggested opening a parallel investigation line to delve deeper into the possible link between the pesticide and unexplained deaths in that region. Months later, the impact was greater than I imagined. Audits began on the ranch and surrounding areas, and the community started to feel heard after years of silence. In my experience as a forensic doctor, something as small as a nearly invisible buckle became the key to opening a door that seemed closed forever. I understood that in our work, we must learn to stop, observe calmly, and not underestimate what seems insignificant, because the truth often hides in details that only a patient look can discover. This case taught me that lesson for life, and every time I receive a body, I try to remember that behind every death there is a story that must not be erased or forgotten. After all, justice does not reside only in law or codes, but in honesty and commitment to reality, no matter how harsh or complex it may be. And for me, that small, shining buckle was the evidence no one had seen, and it completely changed a story that seemed written in advance. As I progressed in the investigation, I became aware that the small object, the buckle with the medical emblem, was actually a window into a network far more complex than I had initially imagined. Behind a death that seemed routine, there was a web of social, environmental, and human conflicts that demanded to be unraveled with patience and rigor. That is why, even though time and routine pressed heavily in the laboratory, I decided to take each hour and every step calmly, leaving nothing to chance. We repeatedly returned to examine the clothes, photographs, and details of the scene. The family was a valuable resource, not only for their information, but for the human dimension they brought to the story. Beyond grief, the concern for the truth they might come to know was a silent driving force that pushed me not to settle for the initial explanation. During those days, I was in constant contact with the lead detective, the prosecutor, and some lawyers, providing them with every fragment we found, but also insisting that the official version could not be sealed so quickly. The next turn came with the exhaustive review of the lung and heart tissue, complemented by histopathological studies. We found subtle signs of chronic vascular injury, compatible with exposure to toxic compounds, but not evident in a superficial study or from the external examination. These damages, though small, could explain microvascular alterations that ultimately affect the heart and brain. The cause of death was not a massive heart attack, as it might have seemed, but progressive collapse caused by that potentially harmful compound. My team and I realized we were facing a death accelerated by environmental conditions, practically invisible at first glance. Meanwhile, information about the neighbor, originally dismissed as irrelevant, took on an impossible-to-ignore weight. Delving into property disputes, we discovered that certain tensions stem not only from legal disagreements, but also from conflicting positions regarding agricultural practices and pesticide use. While the ranch insisted that its methods were safe and certified, some farmers and local organizations pointed out that side effects, including chronic poisonings, were ignored. According to testimonies, the victim had been one of the few who dared to speak out against this situation. That medical buckle then ceased to be a mere ornament and became a symbol of that quiet and fragile struggle. When I contacted experts in environmental toxicology, I was struck by the complexity of the issue. They explained that the chemical compound found, an organophosphate common in industrial pesticides, can accumulate in the body and deteriorate the nervous and cardiovascular systems over time, but its symptoms are diffuse and easily confused with normal aging diseases. It was an invisible poison, a silent enemy that had crossed the barriers of conventional science to cause what appeared to be a natural death. This revelation made me reflect on the vulnerability of those communities and how lack of oversight and corporate negligence could leave devastating effects. Our forensic work's ability to reveal hidden truths seemed to me, at that moment, both a privilege and a burden. The buckle, tiny, had become the thread that allowed us to follow a tangled skein filled with injustices and forced silences. As the case progressed, tension grew in the professional and social environment. Some actors preferred the case to be closed, accepting the version of a natural death. But we, with scientific evidence in hand, knew we were facing something deeper that required justice and public attention. At a meeting with the authorities, I presented the findings and potential risks to the community. The severity of the situation forced us to request a temporary suspension of activities at the investigated ranch to protect other possible victims. The victim's family, while satisfied with the progress, feared retaliation and lived with a latent fear that their testimony might put them in danger. We spoke extensively with them, reinforcing that the search for truth was also an act of community protection and a humanitarian duty. That closeness reminded me that behind every diagnosis, behind every finding, lies the tangible reality of people suffering and needing someone to listen carefully. Over time, local media began to take an interest in the case, also driven by civil organizations that recognized potential environmental and social impact. The truth gradually came to light, highlighting how a simple metal buckle, almost ignored, allowed the dismantling of a series of deceptions and negligence. Some grieving neighbors and farm workers approached me to tell their stories, accounts filled with fear, hope, and pain, confirming that this was not an isolated incident, but perhaps a reflection of a systemic problem hidden to protect economic interests. As more data emerged, measures were proposed to better regulate pesticide use, protect vulnerable communities, and create stricter monitoring protocols in these rural areas. There was also a call to strengthen collaboration between medical, judicial, and environmental entities. All this thanks to the tenacity and thoroughness that led me not to dismiss that buckle, not to accept natural death as a premature conclusion. Over these years, I have handled many cases, but few have taught me as much about the importance of detail, active listening, and patience in a world where urgency often prevails. Every time I remember that day in the laboratory, I feel a deep respect for the life that was lost and for the consequences that a small, almost invisible piece can trigger. That buckle was not just physical evidence. It was a key for a community to begin to be visible in its struggle, for a silenced truth to find an echo in justice. Thus, forensic science becomes an act of memory and vindication, capable of transcending death to give voice to the living. This case made me understand more than ever that the work of the forensic doctor does not end when a report is signed. It is in every piece of information, in every ignored corner, in every testimony hidden in the shadows. And although sometimes fatigue or pressure pushes us to seek quick exits, true responsibility lies in looking honestly and patiently, as if every detail were the last piece needed to complete the puzzle of a life and a story. Perhaps the greatest lesson was discovering that truth is not only a scientific or legal fact. It is also a matter of human sensitivity and commitment, that sometimes justice is a face in the small, almost invisible details that others overlook, and that if one is willing to stop and look carefully, those pieces can reveal hidden worlds far beyond what seems apparent. This case, with its buckle and secrets, remains a living memory that accompanies me in every day and every discovery. It challenges me never to lower my guard, and always to trust those moments of doubt and pause, because within them may lie the path to the truth that no one wanted to see. Thus, I learned that being a forensic doctor is much more than a profession of autopsies and protocols. It is, above all, a humble and profound exercise of listening, understanding, and tireless searching, so that every story has its voice, no matter how small it may seem. Because in the end, it is not just about discovering how someone died, but about honoring the life they had before, understanding it, and protecting it so that those deaths do not remain forgotten or ignored. That buckle was a corner from which it was possible to look further, and now I know that in every case, in every body that comes into our hands, there may be a buckle waiting to be seen. You just have to learn to look calmly and respectfully at what no one else wants to see. That case began to take on dimensions I never imagined at first, and the buckle, which seemed like a trivial detail, continued to be the key to understanding not only the cause of death, but also to uncovering a much more complex human and social network. As we continue with the analysis, the pressure increased. Not so much external pressure, although there was some of that I have no doubt, but that internal feeling, a mix of responsibility and curiosity, which forced me to review every detail over and over again. I knew I could not afford any mistakes, especially because we were about to challenge powerful interests that prefer to keep everything silent. Sometimes I wonder if forensic science was prepared to address these tangled conflicts involving real lives, fears, and hidden truths behind a calm facade. That's when I decided to request additional samples of water and soil around the ranch. It was not a usual part of our practice, but I was certain that if that toxic compound was present in the body, it had to come from some environmental source. Both the family and the neighbors supported this request, although not without some fear. The community seemed trapped in a net difficult to untangle, because the local economy depended largely on those lands and the work on the ranch, even at the cost of the health and peace of its inhabitants. We awaited the results with a mixture of anxiety and calm. The days in the laboratory felt endless, each analysis a window into another possible nail in the coffin of the official version. When they finally delivered the report, the confirmation paralyzed us for a moment. Alarming levels of organophosphates in the soil and water, concentrations that not only exceeded permitted limits, but explained everything we had seen in the victim's tissue. That small buckle symbolizing the profession of the person, a doctor with years of service and respect, was at the same time a silent witness to a death accelerated by something invisible but deadly. What came next was the hardest part to face. Seeing how these results were received by different sectors. For environmental authorities, it was an urgent wake-up call, but also a dangerous one. Some ranch stakeholders vehemently denied everything, insisting the studies were incorrect or biased. Legal disputes intensified, and, amid it all, the family lived in constant fear that something might happen to them. I spoke with them many times by phone and in person, trying to convey that their struggle, though difficult, was essential so that it would not be forgotten. From a professional perspective, the case opened a door to a field I had always touched on from afar, but never understood deeply: environmental toxicology in rural contexts and its real impact on public health. Every report I read, every interview I conducted, led me to the conclusion that that ranch and many others like it were just the tip of the iceberg. This was not an isolated tragedy, but another example of how agricultural practices and lack of effective regulation can condemn entire communities without anyone taking responsibility. For weeks, meetings with judicial agents and experts in various fields became an indispensable routine. It was a sort of silent battle in which the buckle kept appearing in images and documents as a symbol of the untold story. At every work session and preliminary report we exchanged, I insisted that we not lose a human connection, that we remember that behind the data, there was a silenced voice. Tensions rose. Some tried to undermine our credibility, but my team and I knew we were on the right path. Science, properly applied, always ends up revealing the less visible truths. What also surprised me deeply was the resistance I found among some sectors of community itself. Many feared acknowledging and speaking about the problem, afraid of losing their jobs or being stigmatized. Others were convinced, or at least resigned, that this was the way of life, unable to imagine alternatives. It was then that I understood our work could not be limited to analyzing bodies or remains. We had to contribute something more, open spaces for dialogue and reflection, so that people could also see themselves as part of change and not just silent victims. I especially remember that day when one of the closest neighbors approached me after a community meeting. He was an older, quiet, calm man with a voice somewhat broken by age and emotion. He told me he had never spoken to anyone about what was happening, but that this case, that Buckle, and our insistence on not letting everything slide so easily gave him hope. Maybe this time someone will really listen, he said to me. It was a moment that reminded me why we had started this whole process. Beyond scientific rigor, bureaucracy, and laws, there was a heart of those people, and it was for them that we had to redouble our efforts. Meanwhile, we continued deepening the autopsy, and each new test added pieces to the puzzle. We found that not only the victims showed those damages, but other recent cases in the area displayed similar patterns, although they had never been thoroughly investigated. This made the obligation to uncover the whole truth even more urgent. The buckle, which at first seemed a simple ornament, transformed into an emblem of resistance and denunciation. The story it contained challenged all my previous concepts of natural death, because here death was neither simple nor dignified in itself. It was a tangible reflection of social injustices and environmental harms invisible to the common eye. When we finally presented a comprehensive report with all the evidence, the public response was stronger than I expected. Local and national media began to cover the story meticulously. The victim's face and that small buckle appeared in the reports, and public conversation revolved around the responsibility that had to be assumed to prevent more tragedies. The community began to organize, to demand changes, to not allow others to suffer in silence as that person had. It was a slow and uneven process, but the seed was planted. Throughout this entire journey, I never stopped thinking about the power of attention to detail and how something as small as a buckle can become a silent witness to much greater injustices. I learned that our work is not just to find a technical and clinical cause of death, but also to be a bridge between science and humanity. To remember that each case is a story that deserves to be heard with depth, patience, and respect. The most unsettling yet motivating thing about all this is that today, years later, the buckle remains a symbolic image in the talks and conferences I give about the importance of forensic medicine in complex social contexts. Because if anything became clear, it is that in every body, in every scene, there may be a buckle waiting to reveal hidden truths, silent injustices, and silent struggles. This case, with its buckle and its secrets, not only changed my way of seeing the profession, but also made me understand that being a forensic doctor involves something much bigger than technical skill. It means being a witness and messenger of lives that after death deserve justice, memory, and respect. That behind each finding, no matter how small it may seem, there's an entire world that can be discovered and valued. And that seeking that truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable, is the very essence of our commitment to life and society. Thus ended one of the most difficult and enriching chapters of my career, with the satisfaction, though mixed with the weight of reality, of having achieved that a family, a community, and perhaps many more could have answers and find a voice amidst the silence. The buckle, eternal in my memory, reminds me every day that in our work there are no absolute truths nor rushed conclusions, but the obligation to always look beyond, with calm, respect, and above all, humanity. What happened after presenting the full report was something that, even now, I find hard to believe happened exactly as it did. The buckle, that small metal piece, which at first I thought was just a simple element, began to take on enormous symbolic weight, not only for us as researchers, but for the entire community and everyone involved. I never imagined that such a tiny object could become the center of a controversy that would span scientific, social, and political realms. After the report was delivered and analyzed by the relevant authorities, dissenting voices began to emerge questioning our methodology, the validity of the findings, and even more so, the origin of the information. For some, of course, it was easier to discredit the messenger than to face an uncomfortable reality. Theories, rumors, Even attempts at discreditation were woven that affected not only my team, but also me personally. I received intimidating calls and messages, some serious enough that we took precautions. However, none of that succeeded in undermining the conviction we had that we were doing the right thing. The unexpected turn came when a young researcher from another city, interested in the case and our line of work, got in touch with us to share similar results obtained in a nearby town. He had identified similar patterns in animals, people, and the environment, without anyone so far having connected it to the toxicity in the agricultural products frequently used in the area. This dramatically expanded the scope of the problem. What initially seemed like an isolated case began to be seen as a symptom of a greater illness, something systemic and deeply rooted in local and national practices concerning the management of chemicals. It was then that the community's desperation became explicit in every meeting we held. No one wanted to lose their job, but everyone was starting to understand that something had to change. It was no longer just the death of an elderly person with whom, perhaps, many had become accustomed. It was tangible evidence that the health of hundreds, maybe thousands, was at risk. Mothers worried about their children's health. Farmers seeing their crops and animals affected. This entire social fabric began to take on an urgency we could tangibly feel in the atmosphere. However, the real catalyst for change was a small group of young activists, some from the town itself and others from different cities, who had the necessary drive to confront those who seemed untouchable. They organized forums, sought legal advice, managed to coordinate the affected individuals, and used social media to raise awareness of the problem. It was impressive to see how a buckle and the story it carried, this mix of death, pollution, and resistance, could be the trigger for a genuine social change movement. From my position, I became a constant support, not only with data and scientific results, but with the hope that sometimes seemed to waver between exhaustion and uncertainty. I realized that accepting this role, which went beyond the laboratory and the autopsy room, was essential for truth to have real weight, because science, no matter how rigorous, also needs a heart to drive it to serve people. Those people with complex lives who suddenly become a case file. The legal pressure was relentless. Big economic interests began to move, and we faced a whirlwind of lawyers, appeals, and smear campaigns. There came a point when it became complicated to tell who was an ally and who was an enemy within the community, because fear and misinformation tend to divide much faster than knowledge and unity. The official response from the authorities was delayed, and when it came, it was half-hearted and dissatisfied both the affected and us. This led us to double our efforts, document with even more precision, seek allies beyond the local sphere, and insist that ignoring the problem was no longer an option. Amid this scenario, new forensic evidence proved to be another key piece of the puzzle. We decided to analyze samples not only from people and animals, but also plants, insects, and even soil microorganisms, searching for traces of toxic compounds. The results brutally confirmed that the contamination was much deeper and more widespread than we had initially thought. The concentrations detected were worrying for any living organism, and the health damage revealed a clear pattern of chronic poisoning affecting multiple levels, from mild symptoms to severe irreversible diseases. What impacted me the most was discovering how those substances, invisible to the common eye, had infiltrated the community's daily life, from the water they drank to the air they breathed, and how that buckle on the deceased doctor's clothing was a metaphor for that invisibility. Something small, seemingly insignificant, but capable of telling a much bigger and more painful story than any spoken word. As months passed, the case took on an almost judicial character. Public hearings were convened, and testimonies that had remained silent until then were heard. Every word we listened to echoed, making the quest for justice even more urgent. This part was especially hard for me because it was impossible not to be viscerally moved by the stories of those people. They were not just figures or scientific data. They were memories, losses, anguish, fears, broken hopes, and shattered dreams. Still, not everything was bleak. There were also moments of profound solidarity, encounters that taught me invaluable lessons about human resilience. Like the day the entire community gathered to clean the river crossing the ranch, a symbolic act showing their commitment to change and care for a place that, despite the damage, remained their home. Seeing people of all ages working together, sharing efforts and words of support, made me think that, amid adversity, there's always room for hope. However, the last twist in the case came when, thanks to a joint investigation with the university and the community, we managed to identify a factor that until then had gone unnoticed: the connection between contamination and certain labor practices that, out of ignorance or necessity, expose workers directly without adequate protection measures. This information opened new lines of investigation and served to pressure the implementation of stricter regulations and safety protocols that needed to be adopted immediately. But the most relevant aspect was a reaction of the affected individuals themselves. Seeing how, little by little, they began to demand better conditions, question old customs, and take charge of their own health was the true triumph of the case. The buckle, which started as a tiny detail on the clothing of a man who died seemingly of natural causes, had become the emblem of a collective struggle, a symbol of how paying attention to details can transform reality and save lives. Throughout these weeks of work, sleepless nights, and endless debates, I learned that forensic medicine is much more than applying techniques to determine causes of death. It is a profession that involves a total commitment to the truth, yes, but also to the humanity that truth represents. Every autopsy, every analysis, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, has the potential to change the course of a life or an entire community. Closing that chapter, I realized that the buckle, such a simple piece of evidence, was actually a constant reminder. Reality is full of invisible details that only patience, observation, and the courage to look beyond can reveal. And that in our work, we must always stay alert to discover those signals that may seem trivial but hide stories deserving to be told and heard with respect and sensitivity. Today, when I talk about this case in different forums or with colleagues, I don't just mention the importance of scientific rigor or technical thoroughness. I also speak about the need to understand the context, the social and human implications that every task carries. Because at the end of the day, our commitment goes far beyond the body. It is to justice, memory, and the dignity of those who left behind a story that still has much to teach us. And so, that buckle stayed with me as a powerful symbol of my career and my life. A small piece that, without knowing it, unleashed a chain of changes, denunciations, and hopes. It taught us that although truth often seems buried under layers of silence, bureaucracy, and fear, there will always be someone willing to dig it up, give it voice, and fight, so that truth not only becomes known, but transforms the way we see and care for those around us. Because although death leads us to answer difficult questions, it also forces us to look closely at life and everything that makes us human. And that buckle, so discreet but essential, reminded me that there, in the small, may lie the key to opening the doors of justice, memory, and hope for many. And that is, without a doubt, the deepest legacy I can have as a forensic doctor. As the investigation progressed and the pressure on everyone involved grew, the buckle remained present, silent yet powerful, reminding us that sometimes the problem is not what we see at first glance, but what remains hidden around us, what we prefer not to see or dismiss because it makes us uncomfortable. I remember one afternoon, while reviewing reports in my office, receiving a voice message that completely changed the focus of the case. It was from a worried wife, who with a trembling voice told me that her husband had also suffered strange health problems, symptoms that up until then we had not directly linked to the contamination. That call was the beginning of a much broader network of testimonies, stories that wove a clear pattern of afflictions that science still had to explain precisely, but that human experience confirmed harshly. The following days were a mix of physical and mental exhaustion. We had to coordinate the team, prepare samples, analyze data, and above all, listen like never before. Those affected wanted to tell their stories, but they were also seeking answers, and in that search, we were the bridge between the facts and hope. Each new testimony added another layer to the complexity of the problem, but also strengthened us as a team, uniting us in conviction that we were facing a crisis that could no longer be minimized. One of the most unexpected turns that left an indelible mark on me was when we discovered that the contamination came, in large part, from a combination of pesticides applied without any regulation or effective control. That fact, hidden for years under contract silences and hush money, was the tip of a larger iceberg. We then faced leaked documents, complaints intersected with immense economic interests, and a direct fight against a system that, in many cases, preferred to look the other way. The buckle had become a symbol because it had been a silent witness to all that, a remnant of the day and of the person who had pointed us to the path toward that ignored truth. I remember that during one of the community meetings, an elderly farmer with tired but firm eyes told me something I will never forget. "Doctor, that buckle is not only on the clothes of the man who died, it is on our skin, on the land, in the lungs of our children." That phrase resonated so much that I used it in several presentations to reflect the depth of the problem. It was as if somehow that small object was speaking to us, forcing us to listen to what until then we had wanted to avoid. The tension grew when some of us began receiving more direct threats. My family and I had to take security measures, something I never imagined would happen simply for doing our work honestly. It was a dark period where the line between vocation and personal risk became blurred. But it was also a time when solidarity with the community gave us strength. Many of them not only supported us, but also became guardians of information and advocates for change, aware that their future depended on something different happening. Besides external threats, we encountered bureaucratic obstacles designed to prolong the process and discourage those seeking justice. Requests went unanswered, laboratories disconnected, formal refusals to share key information. All of this pushed us to be even more creative and persistent. The workdays became endless, and more than once, I felt the weight of impotence. But the image of that buckle, small, almost a relic amid the chaos, remained firm, a reminder that we were finally pulling the truth from where it was buried. When we eventually managed to consolidate a thorough report, including results demonstrating the direct relationship between contamination and the diseases detected, the impact was immediate. New hearings were convened, this time with national and international media present, amplifying the pressure on authorities to act. But the story was not simple. Political complexity, economic interests, and a lack of will in some sectors caused the governmental response to be weak, defensive, and at times contradictory. It was not just a scientific problem. We were facing an issue that touched sensitive core to power and those who maintained control through ignorance or collective resignation. Amidst all this, one of the most surprising and hard-to-accept findings was realizing the role that misinformation and lack of education had played in perpetuating the problem. Many workers and farmers did not know the real danger they were exposed to, nor how to react to symptoms that one day might seem transient but over time led to fatal outcomes. That silent sadness struck me deeply and made me think about the responsibility we have as those who handle science to take knowledge beyond the laboratories, to those who need it most. It was then that, together with a group of activists and several experts, we promoted environmental education workshops, training for the safe use of chemical products, and community campaigns to improve pollution monitoring. The response was slow, but growing. Some resisted change out of fear or mistrust. Others embraced that opportunity with the hope of protecting the little they had left. Many times, I felt we were in a long battle against inertia and indifference, where every small step forward was a necessary victory to avoid giving up. The buckle continued to be a recurring element in conversations, not only because we had originally found on that body that started us on this tragedy, but because it had become a metaphor for all the invisible yet forceful realities around us. That metal piece taught us that apparently simple cases should not be dismissed, that behind one detail might lie the keys to open doors others would prefer to keep closed. It was a constant lesson for all of us, a reminder that scientific rigor must always be accompanied by empathy and courage. However, the greatest twist I could not have imagined came when I received an unexpected call from a young researcher who, working in a biotechnology lab, had identified genetic mutations in biological samples from the affected community. These mutations seemed to be directly linked to chronic exposure to the detected chemicals. The news not only amplified the severity of the issue, but opened a new dimension. It was no longer only about visible and painful diseases, but about damage that could affect future generations. The buckle then ceased to be a simple object and became the symbol of a problem that spanned not only the present, but also the future of those people. That revelation pushed us to redouble our efforts, seek international collaboration, and demand more resources to face a public health crisis that seldom makes the headlines of major news. The struggle became more complex because it was also a battle for knowledge, to confront ignorance and prejudices that prevented the full acceptance of the reality. It was a time when science met politics and social issues in the most difficult and necessary arena, life and death. Meanwhile, the community began to show profound changes. They no longer just waited for external solutions. Many took the initiative to organize small environmental monitoring committees, pressure their local authorities, and promote sustainable alternatives for their land and families. The buckle, in every meeting, was displayed as a symbol of memory and struggle, a testimony that even the smallest evidence can unleash enormous transformation if given the value it deserves. What surprised me most was how this case, which at one point I thought would remain locked in just another file, started to resonate beyond the region. Other affected groups began contacting us, seeking guidance, strategies, and support to face their own battles against contamination and injustice. It was as if that buckle had become a beacon, illuminating paths still full of uncertainty but also hope. However, the personal cost was high. Sleepless nights, arguments with colleagues or authorities, emotional exhaustion, and constant pressure left deep marks. There were moments when I thought of giving up, of yielding to fatigue and disappointment. But always in those moments, the image of that buckle, the story it told, and above all the people who depended on us not stopping, pulled me back to work. Because I understood that detail, that small piece of evidence, was much more than an object. It was a voice of those who could no longer speak, and the hope for those still fighting for a better tomorrow. Looking back, I can say this case changed my perspective on forensic medicine. It made me understand that our work does not end with causes of death, but is the beginning of a commitment to integral truth, collective well-being, and social justice. That in every detail, no matter how small, may lie the key to unravel mysteries that change the fate of entire communities. And that to fulfill that task, technical knowledge is not enough. Humanity, bravery, and the ability to listen, even when what we hear hurts or challenges our comfort, are also needed. That is why, whenever I think again about the buckle, I do not see it as a mere object found in an autopsy. I see it as a living lesson that reminds me that science can be an instrument of change, that perseverance in adversity has immense value, and that commitment to truth, no matter how difficult, is always worthwhile. Although the path is long, complex, and painful, there will always be details around us that, like that buckle, await to be discovered, heard, and used to build a more just future. And it is in this conclusion, in the symbolic weight of that forgotten piece of metal, that I leave something for those who listen or read me today. Never underestimate the details. Do not fear to delve beyond the apparent. And remember that behind every piece of evidence, there's a human story worth telling and protecting until the end. Because sometimes in the smallest things lies the key that opens the doors to true change, and that is the most valuable legacy any of us can leave. What came next was a whirlwind of discoveries and confrontations that took us far beyond anything we had ever imagined. When the biotechnology laboratory confirmed the genetic mutations linked to exposure to those pesticides, we understood that the crisis no longer affected only immediate health, but the very essence of life in that community. That revelation shattered any notion of a local or temporary problem. Now, we were talking about cumulative damage that could be passed on to future generations, an invisible burden carried by the land, the air, and the bodies of people who could barely imagine the magnitude of what was happening to them. That information, though devastating, also gave us a powerful tool. We began mapping the cases more precisely, identifying critical areas, distribution patterns, and possible sources to control. But it was not easy. Political and business resistance intensified. They did not want a single word beyond the official version that minimized the harm. Attempts to discredit us became more frequent. They questioned our methods, doubted our ethics, and tried to portray those affected as people looking to exploit the situation. It was a battle on all fronts, and although exhausting, we knew we could not stop. The buckle remained there, almost as a reminder that the truth, no matter how small it may seem, can open cracks that eventually bring down even the strongest wall of lies. Organizing the community was perhaps one of the most complex challenges. There was fear, distrust, and the feeling that nothing would change. Some farmers, for example, depended economically on those pesticides, even at the cost of their own health and that of their families. Others fear reprisals or losing the little support they receive from certain sectors. But we were able to build bridges with local leaders, people respected by their neighbors who sincerely conveyed the importance of caring not only for the land, but also for their bodies and their children's future. Getting those previously silenced voices to unite was a slow process, but fundamental to giving the struggle a collective and sustainable meaning. Meanwhile, within the team, we faced our own tensions. The constant pressure caused friction and internal challenges. Some colleagues had doubts about the best course of action, worried about safety, political impact, or even personal burnout. At those moments, more than science or data, what sustained us was stories that arrived at our office, photographs sent by families, and above all, the memory of that buckle, a tangible metaphor that even the smallest thing can change the course of a story that seemed already written. It was a lesson for all of us, the importance of empathy and collective strength to keep hope alive. One twist that never left my mind was when we received an anonymous letter with documents and testimonies detailing clandestine practices in pesticide application, including irregular schedules, excessive doses, and complete abandonment of safety protocols for both workers and the environment. This shed light on how negligence and corruption had intertwined to perpetuate the problem. The documents mentioned names, companies, and officials, but also showed that silence and complacency were equally powerful accomplices. It was a hard blow, but also the impetus we needed to demand deeper investigations and greater transparency. At the same time, international experts participated, bringing new perspectives, technologies, and comparisons with similar cases from other countries. The scale of the problem resonated as a global warning because, although each region has its particularities, the story of exploitation, contamination, and harm always had a common denominator: vulnerable communities paying a price no economic benefit can justify. The buckle, place and context, transcended its origin to become a recognizable symbol in forums, conferences, and reports, an emblem conveying an uncomfortable but necessary truth. It was also a time to rethink strategies because science alone could not solve such a complex problem. We needed to influence public policies, strengthen health and environmental networks, and expand education so that people would understand the risks and alternatives. Some pesticide substitution projects began to take shape with the active participation of the farmers themselves who, with their experience and ancestral knowledge, contributed viable and sustainable solutions. That convergence of knowledge between the scientific and the community seemed to be the only real way to reverse the damage. But it also meant facing much lobbying, opposing interests, and a permanent struggle to keep attention and resources alive. Of course, the fight came at a cost. On a personal level, threats became more frequent, no longer directed only at me, but also at other team members and families in the community who got involved. Insecurity grew, and we had to take extreme measures, all under the watchful silence of many authorities who preferred not to intervene. There were moments when the pressure was such that exhaustion threatened to break us, but then we received calls or letters of encouragement, testimonies from people who felt for the first time that someone was listening and fighting for them, and that gave us unexpected strength. It was a reminder that our work mattered, not only in laboratories or courts, but in the lives of those suffering the consequences. Public hearings, when they were finally convened, were scenes of harsh confrontations, but also hope. Seeing the community raise their voices, share their pain, but also their will for change, was one of the most impactful moments I experienced. The buckle, accompanying the display of evidence, served as an emotional anchor for everyone present. It was not just a metal object, but the symbol of years of struggle, the starting point no one had imagined for what ended up being a movement for justice and dignity. There I understood that a single detail can ignite the spark that transforms the story of a life, a family, or even an entire region. But the battle was far from over. Although the report and the evidence applied pressure, the official responses remained lukewarm and often evasive. It was clear that protecting economic interests outweighed collective health. That is why we sought alliances with international human rights organizations, environmental groups, and independent media that could give the story greater exposure. This openness caused other affected regions to join in the conversation to cross national borders, promoting a broader movement for recognition and struggle against environmental and social impacts resulting from irresponsible practices. Amid all this, science advanced with studies confirming not only genetic damage, but also effects on child development, fertility, and chronic diseases that had gone unnoticed before. With each new piece of data came an even more urgent call to action, but also a deep questioning of how we have allowed such problems to settle for so long in forgotten communities. I felt that my role as a forensic expert expanded, not only to determine causes of death, but to be an active part defending the health and dignity of those people, a task demanding commitment and heart, not just technical knowledge. Despite all the adversities, there were moments of joy and hope. Families began changing their practices. Children received timely treatments or proper advice. Community projects arose from dialogue and regained trust. This combination of multiple efforts generated small but significant changes, seeds of the future that, if nurtured, had the power to transform everything that seemed unstoppable. The buckle, every time I showed it in talks or meetings with authorities, served to remind that change begins with attention to detail and the courage to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. It was a reminder that justice, science, and hope are not separate paths, but inseparable parts of the same quest, one that can only be won if carried out with integrity, patience, and deep humanity. That buckle, a relic of a person and particular moment, became the tangible evidence that even the smallest thing can trigger silent but powerful revolutions. And so, while the community continued learning, fighting, and resisting, we also grew, understanding that the tiniest detail can hold the biggest story and that this is the real and intangible value of our work. And today, when I think about all that has happened, I know there is no turning back. This experience showed me that our work goes beyond the body, death, or cold data. It is a commitment to life, memory, and the justice that all human beings deserve. The buckle, as simple as it may seem, will always be a reminder that we must look beyond, listen carefully, and never underestimate the power that small pieces of evidence can have to change the fate not only of one person but many. Because in the end, in the search for truth, every detail counts, and every voice, even the one no longer here, deserves to be heard and honored. Continue with the story amidst all the pressure and tensions we were going through. There was an episode that still seems almost incredible to me when I remember it. One night, while reviewing some reports at home, I received a call that completely altered the course of our investigation. On the other end of the line, a trembling, barely audible voice told me there was more, something no one had even suspected, something that could change everything we had discovered up to that moment. They asked me to be discreet and to meet in a safe place the next day. I couldn't know if it was a trap, but there was something in that mix of fear and urgency that made me accept. I wasn't sure if I was facing an ally or another enemy hidden in the shadows of that case. The next day, we met in a secluded park outside the city. The person, wrapped in a trench coat and with their head covered, handed us a thick folder. Inside were documents and photographs with very specific and previously unknown details about the distribution and application chain of pesticides. Not only that, but also records showing how certain authorities had received bribes to look the other way, and above all, indications that the contamination had been deliberately underestimated to protect commercial interests. This not only made the crisis more severe, but turned it into a matter of systemic corruption, established and tolerated by those who were supposed to protect the population. That meeting was key because, in addition to providing tangible information, it confirmed something we already suspected. The truth behind that buckle, that small metal piece that had triggered everything, was much deeper and darker than simple negligence. We were facing a powerful network that used misinformation and fear to silence voices and perpetuate damage that, little by little, had become invisible to those who did not want to see it. That feeling of being in the middle of a game where the rules changed and the pawns were human lives was, without a doubt, one of the hardest moments. But it also served to reaffirm our commitment and speed up our strategy. With that new evidence, we decided to take a bolder step. We organized a meeting with independent journalists, environmental activists, and lawyers specialized in human rights. We knew the key was to make the truth public and for social pressure to become a driving force for change. But it was not easy either. The documents were sensitive, and the threat of reprisals was real. To ensure everyone's safety, we established a strict confidentiality protocol and coordinated with international organizations that could support our work. We began weaving a network of support that transcended borders because, although the fight seemed local, we understood that harmful practices in the use of pesticides were a global problem and that joining forces was essential. In the following weeks, the atmosphere in Guadalajara and the affected localities became tense. On the one hand, acceptance and solidarity grew among those who once felt voiceless. On the other, pressures to stop us intensified, with veiled threats and campaigns to discredit the team and the families involved. But, curiously, each attempt to silence the movement only strengthened it. The clarity of the facts and the trust we had managed to build with the community acted as a shield. However, there was emotion were evident in everyone, and the uncertainty about what was coming forced us to remain firm and careful, aware that this was a battle that would not be won overnight. One day, when we least expected it, an unexpected twist revolutionized our view of the case. We received news that in another region of the country, hundreds of kilometers away, a similar episode had occurred, with exposure patterns and genetic damages matching our investigation. However, that community had achieved a legal breakthrough that forced authorities to review their policies on pesticide use. This discovery generated renewed energy in our team. We understood that what began as a local fight could become a national, even international, precedent to stop these practices. Our work had transcended the forensic field and become a spark for a much larger movement. It was amid this whirlwind that I paused for a moment to reflect on the path traveled. It all started from a buckle forgotten on the clothes of a man nobody had suspected, a small object, insignificant to many, that held the key to revealing a reality that many had preferred to hide. I wondered how many times in life we are carried away by the obvious without stopping to look closely at the details that can change everything. The buckle became not only a symbol of the fight, but a lasting lesson on the importance of careful observation, patience, and empathy in the practice of our profession. The growth of the movement was, naturally, accompanied by resistance, but also by valuable lessons. We began to understand the need to listen to the community beyond the numbers and scientific analyses. Each testimony, each personal story became irrefutable evidence that behind the data was life, dreams, fears, and hopes. Sharing spaces with those affected revealed to us the power of solidarity and humility. I learned that being a forensic professional does not only mean diagnosing a cause of death, but assuming an ethical commitment to the truth that affects the survival and well-being of many others. Initiatives then emerge involving both local authorities and civil organizations to create environmental monitoring programs and to educate new generations about responsible and sustainable farming practices. Not everything was linear or perfect. There were stumbles and setbacks, but the feeling of advancing and transforming realities gave strength to continue. Every small victory, every child who received relevant medical care, and every farmer who chose less aggressive methods of the land were signs that we were sowing a different future. That, for me, was perhaps the greatest outcome of all our effort. Of course, there were dark moments, threats reminding us that we were touching powerful, established interests. At times, the feeling of vulnerability overwhelmed us, and sometimes doubts arose about how far we could go without risking the integrity of those who trusted us. But then I remembered that buckle and the immense value such a simple object was capable of carrying. This sustained me when fatigue or despair wanted to win. The buckle had become a beacon, reminding us that the truth is there, in the details others ignore, waiting to be discovered and put in the service of justice. In the end, I understood that this case had been a turning point not only for the affected community or for my career, but for our society in general. We face a reality that forces us to rethink our relationship with nature, public health, and our ethical principles. The buckle was never simply a lost object on a lifeless body. It was a key to opening a path to social awareness and collective responsibility. That experience changed my way of seeing my profession and the usefulness of our work, which must always serve those who need it most, no matter the shadows we must pass through to fulfill that duty. I remember the last words I said in an interview. Let us never underestimate the power of a small piece of evidence, because in it may lie the truth that changes the history of community and perhaps the world. That phrase sums up what I felt and learned in that process. Because in the pursuit of justice and knowledge, every detail, no matter how small, can trigger a chain of events impossible to foresee, with an impact that transcends the immediate and takes root in the collective memory. The buckle will always be a symbol of that commitment, of the patience to listen, and of the courage to act when everything seems to indicate there is no hope. While the community moves forward, with its own wounds but also with renewed will, I continue on my path with the certainty that, as forensic experts, as scientists, or citizens, our work has a broader horizon than the mere confirmation of facts. We are custodians of the truth, instruments to protect human dignity, and agents of change when society decides to look more closely. That is why, in every new investigation, in every small detail we find, I wonder what other silences could be broken and what other stories are waiting to be told. Because the buckle taught me that nothing is too small to be the beginning of a revolution. What followed after that meeting in the park, an exchange of photos, was a meticulous, almost obsessive process of gathering pieces, cross-checking evidence, and deciphering the web of deceit and silence that covered our reality. Every document, every photograph, and every testimony became a step on an ever steeper and slipperier ladder. We knew that the enemy we faced was one who moved skillfully and unscrupulously in the shadows, and also that any oversight could cost much more than words or reputation. Yet, the weight of the truth was a force we could neither ignore nor were willing to. We spent entire days reviewing every paper that had been handed to us, trying to understand not only what was behind the application and distribution of pesticides, but also how that network had been protected and covered up by those with the power to act. That folder was a map, but also a Pandora's box. On one hand, it showed us the magnitude of corruption, documented bribes, adulterated reports, clandestine meetings. On the other, it let us see human faces, too many affected, entire families victims of induced negligence that took the form of an invisible but deadly poison. Among those reports, what particularly caught my attention was a set of medical reports that had been withheld or disregarded in the official version. There were cases in other regions, documented with equal detail, where the symptoms and pathologies matched an unmistakable pattern. Genetic damage, progressive respiratory diseases, neurological disorders linked to chronic exposure to certain chemical substances. The worst part was that many of these documents had been manipulated to appear incidental. The scientific community had been co-opted or ignored, and the true causes were buried beneath a mountain of papers and silences. This discovery pushed us to widen the scope of our investigation. We did not want to remain focused locally because by then we understood we were confronting a systemic phenomenon with implications that exceeded the borders of any municipality or state. We organized multidisciplinary working groups with experts in toxicology, epidemiology, environmental and social law, aimed at collecting data, seeking new evidence, and constructing a solid narrative that could not be easily dismissed. Every advancement we achieved was a step toward justice, but also a rise in the hostility we received. Pressures intensified. Some of my colleagues had contracts canceled or saw their work publicly belittled. There were attempts at discrediting in various fields, even veiled threats arriving in anonymous messages and calls. However, none of this managed to divert us from our path. Something that sustained me during those moments was a conviction that truth has its own force, and that, moreover, the families who entrusted us with their stories deserved to have their voices heard. It was impossible to turn back after having seen what we saw, and even more so after having felt firsthand the power of that small object, the buckle. One of the hardest twists to manage came when we received information about a plan to discredit one of the community leaders who was key in social mobilization. This person, with great courage and sensitivity, had managed to unite several affected families, becoming a fundamental source for our work and a symbol of resistance for many. We alerted some international organizations working with us and reinforced security measures, both digital and physical. It was a tense period, marked by discreet surveillance in meetings and safe places, where the key word was trust. We cannot allow violence or fear to gain ground. Meanwhile, meetings with independent journalists and lawyers began to yield results. The truth started appearing in alternative media, and quickly the repercussions reached circles of power that until then had looked the other way. Fragments of the leaked documents were made public, and although the official response was initially evasive, something had changed. Society began to question the irresponsible handling of pesticides and, above all, demanded answers. Some local authorities, under pressure, had to acknowledge the seriousness of the matter and agreed to participate in dialogue tables with the community. It was a small but notable step, a crack in a wall that seemed indestructible. At that point, news came of another case in a distant state, but with characteristics so similar that the connection could not be a coincidence. This event lifted our spirits and alerted us that the struggle was bigger and more complex. The affected region had obtained a successful legal action, forcing a review and modification of policies on pesticide use. Their victory, although modest, taught us that it was possible to influence the system, that there were mechanisms and tools for justice and public health to prevail. This renewed hope gave us new energy to sustain the effort. From then on, we began rebuilding an increasingly broad network among civil organizations, committed scientists, vulnerable communities, and media outlets committed to the truth. I learned, during those months of work, that forensic work goes far beyond the crime scene or the lifeless body. It is an exercise in dignity, a way of restoring the voice to those who can no longer speak. And even if that voice comes from silence, it is the details, the small clues, that open the door to hear them. I remember that the person who gave me the folder mentioned something that resonated deeply with me. In this fight, the enemy is invisible, but the truth is made up of strokes that cannot be erased. And that was exactly what we faced, an ethereal and powerful enemy that responded with indifference, fear, and lies. But we also found that transparency and the union of different voices could break through that darkness. When we unite science, ethics, and social commitment, truth stops being an abstract concept and becomes a concrete tool to transform lives. There were moments, however, when fatigue seemed to win. The tears of mothers who lost their children were a blow none of us could ignore. Many of those women and men who approached our team hoping to find answers now also faced the injustice of power and impunity. It was then that the buckle took on another dimension for me. That small object, forgotten but irreplaceable, became a symbol of resistance and memory, because in the search for truth, it was also necessary to sustain the memory of those who left us with the broken chain, so that their stories would never be lost to oblivion. One of the anecdotes that marked me deeply was a visit to a family living in a rural area, specifically affected by the irresponsible use of pesticides in nearby crops. The woman who received us showed us with impressive detail her deceased husband's clothes, repeatedly pointing to where that buckle found in the autopsy was located. For them, that detail became much more than forensic evidence. It was a tangible memory of a life cut short by invisible forces. There was no doubt that for that family and many others, we were not just doctors or researchers, but guardians of their truth and justice. As the movement grew and the struggle expanded, we continued to promote joint initiatives between local authorities and civil organizations to push for real change. Environmental monitoring programs began to take shape, aimed at early detection of toxic substances in vulnerable communities. Likewise, workshops and educational campaigns were developed to spread sustainable farming methods, seeking to raise awareness from schools to farming families. Although it was not easy to convince everyone, and there were setbacks, those small seeds hinted at a possible path, one different from what we had inherited. During this time, I understood that my role as a forensic expert also included a deep human contact, the need to listen beyond the obvious and translate those silenced voices into actions that could protect the entire community. We became a bridge between science and society, between death and life, between oblivion and memory, that implied adopting a more comprehensive vision, but also a firmer stance against those who wanted to maintain the status quo, because human dignity is not negotiable, not even under the weight of corruption or political cost. The intensity with which we lived those months left me with lessons that still accompany me today. One of the clearest is the importance of patience and persistence. Time, which justice often seems to lack, is in these cases a silent but infallible ally. If one remains firm and attentive, truth will make its way. The buckle, that simple object, is the clearest reminder that, in our profession, we must look with attentive eyes, because what seems insignificant may be the key to changing a story and, with it, many lives. I will never forget the moment when, at one of the final meetings with the authorities, the public acknowledgement was made of the need to change the regulations for control and use of pesticides. It was neither an immediate nor a perfect victory, but it was the first official recognition that broke years of denial and cover-up. At that moment, I felt that all the efforts, the sleepless nights, the personal risks, had been worth it. It was without a doubt a new beginning. A clear reflection of how the union between science, community, and ethics can break down walls that seemed insurmountable. Now, looking back, I can say that this case marked a before and after in my way of practicing forensic medicine, not only as a technical analysis of the body, but as an indelible commitment to those who suffer the invisible consequences of environmental injustice. The buckle was never a mere finding. It was the insistence of truth amidst indifference, a silent witness that urged us to keep searching and fighting. It was, ultimately, the symbol that every detail has weight and that in our vocation respect for life and death must always go hand in hand. And now, when I meet young doctors or forensic experts just starting their path, I share this experience not only as a technical lesson, but as a reminder of the importance of ethics, patience, and a deep outlook. I tell them to never underestimate a small piece of evidence, for in it may lie the key to changing the course of story, to illuminate the truth many try to hide. May their work transcend the laboratory or the morgue and become a beacon for those seeking justice and dignity. Because, in the end, amid the noise of the world, the rush of days, and the complexity of cases, it is in the details where truth resides. And that truth, simple and small as it may seem, has the power to awaken consciences, move wills, and open paths to a different future. That buckle I once found in a man's clothing, which no one wanted to see, will remain for me the permanent symbol that justice is built with patience, courage, and a conviction that no voice should be silenced nor any suffering ignored. When I close my eyes and think of everything that happened, I feel a deep respect for those who trusted our work and an immense responsibility that still weighs on my shoulders. I know the fight continues, that there are still many invisible buckles and other stories waiting to be discovered. And it is clear to me that, as forensic experts and as human beings, our mission is not to let those truths slip away, no matter how small, because within them lies a flame that can ignite justice and hope that I clearly remember how, just as we were beginning to consolidate the first results and media attention was growing, a blow came that almost made us stumble. It was an unexpected leak, but not from our sources or the groups we collaborated with, rather from within our own team. One of the young researchers, someone in whom I had placed my trust, began to show changes in attitude, prolonged moments of silence, and decisions he hadn't made before. At first, we thought it was exhaustion, the pressure of everything we were facing, but soon we knew it was something more serious. Someone was pressuring him, trying to corrupt the integrity of our investigation. That experience was almost like a shadow that silently slipped into the midst of our struggle. It not only forced us to increase security measures and take extreme precautions when sharing the most sensitive information, but it also brought to the table a fundamental element we barely talked about: human vulnerability. Those of us confronting that intangible enemy were not immune to weariness, fear, or doubt. It was then that I understood that, to maintain the honesty of the work, we had to build a trust environment so solid that external attacks could not even threaten it. It was not just a matter of intelligence or scientific skill, but a moral strength tested every day. From that point on, the tension intensified. Every document we provided, every testimony we gathered, seemed to ignite new centers of resistance. We saw obstacles multiply, orders to deny information, subtle repression through the courts, even the activation of smear campaigns on social media aimed at some of the community leaders we work with. At times, it seemed that the structures we were trying to provoke trembled with every step we took, but then solidified again with the firm intention of crushing any hint of truth. And yet, we did not give up. I particularly remember one night when we were reviewing files in a laboratory, and one of my colleagues found something that had gone unnoticed in a previous review. It was a series of records of pesticide sales and usage showing unusual movements, exorbitant concentrations on key dates, and electronic correspondences that appear to indicate the direct involvement of public officials in authorizing and covering up illicit activities. But the most revealing thing was a direct link between those operations and some industries promoting their products as safe and ecological, when in reality they were far from it. That revelation forced us to rethink our analysis strategy. It was no longer just the health of a municipality or state at stake, but the integrity of an economic model sustained by the tacit acceptance of risks and invisible victims. The enemy, who until then seemed invisible, began to show its face in contracts, digital signatures, and policies designed to protect particular interests within the bureaucracy. That gave us tools, but also more powerful enemies. Still, the buckle remained the silent symbol reminding us every day of the importance of that meticulous work. Amid all this struggle, something unexpected happened that deeply marked me. In the early hours of morning, I received an unscheduled call. It was a trembling voice, someone who, with the fear that silence imposes, wanted to share crucial information. An anonymous informant, apparently close to one of the laboratories responsible for analyzing samples collected during autopsies, claimed that a group had begun altering results to favor the official versions denying the influence of pesticides. It was a confirmation we did not want, the sign of a system prepared to systematically manipulate the truth. We knew we had reached a point of no return. We then crossed another line that many people do not want to acknowledge. Corruption, when combined with public health and death, becomes especially cruel and difficult to face. The affected people not only die or fall ill, but their voices are silenced by mechanisms of power that prefer to hide the facts to protect their profits. Therefore, advancing that investigation meant uncovering not only negligence or mistakes, but a complex structure that sacrificed lives to maintain privileges. That harsh and disheartening reality was what pushed us to be even more meticulous, to scrutinize every piece of evidence with a magnifying glass, to listen carefully to every human story that reached our ears. With the help of forensic computer experts, we began analyzing metadata from emails, phone records, and encryptions that at first glance seemed technical or inaccessible. In that process, we discovered communication patterns pointing to clandestine meetings, covert agendas, and the planning of a coordinated strategy to prevent certain evidence from reaching public opinion. That invisible network, operating between offices, government agencies, and private laboratories, was a true force that had kept the truth buried for so many years. Yet, it was also vulnerable. At a particular moment, one of the activists shared with us a secretly recorded video of a meeting between businessmen and officials. In that recording, we clearly heard the intention to hide toxic studies, scientifically discredit testimonies, and promote fear campaigns so that public opinion would not support the demands. It was that moment, after months of resistance and pressure, that we understood we were not only measuring the impact of an environmental problem, but witnessing the battle between truth and power, between ethics and cynicism. And although it seemed that struggle was overwhelming us, it also made us aware of the magnitude of what we were defending. In the midst of that turmoil, the buckle reappeared in several cases. We began to recognize that it was not an isolated finding, but a symbolic and real marker of the truncated history of many families. It was the last visible link between the person and the truth they tried to silence. When we visited homes shattered by grief, that small object was the only tangible thing left to represent memory. And with that symbol in mind, the responsibility took on a clear and forceful shape. From that moment on, every report had to be impeccable, every testimony respected, and every piece of evidence protected. The times continued to be difficult. There were days when hopelessness felt tangible, and fatigue made everything seem uphill. But there were also priceless moments. Meetings with families where, upon delivering the results with the truth revealed, emotion mingled with gratitude. In those moments, I understood that our work became an act of poetic justice, an honor to give those people recognition of their losses, and a commitment that they would not be forgotten. That human bond was my greatest motivation to move forward. Gradually, the story began to filter into increasingly diverse sectors. Some international organizations took up the cause and provided technical and legal support, giving new air to our struggle. Subliminally, social pressure began to take effect. Meetings were organized where internationally recognized scientists endorsed our findings and joined the demand for transparency and change. Hand in hand with public opinion, the possibility arose to open the doors to legal and regulatory reforms that had been evaded for years by those seeking to maintain the status quo. That day, when for the first time the national press dedicated entire segments to our investigation, I felt a mix of relief and responsibility. We knew the road was still long, and that what we were achieving could be threatened or delayed. But the fact that the victims' voices and scientific evidence began to resonate with large audiences was a great step. It was confirmation that the truth had begun to find its place, and that our insistence on that small buckle, on that seemingly insignificant detail, was the spark that ignited the attention needed to move the whole machinery. In the weeks following that exposure, we faced our toughest tests. Attempts to stop the investigation, legal pressures, political maneuvers, and the persistent risk that always surrounds those who fight against powerful interests. But there was also unexpected solidarity, the collective strength that arises when truth becomes a beacon. We began to receive messages of support from other states, even from abroad. Similar stories joined in. weaving a network of resistance born thanks to that buckle and the conviction that there's no path to justice without respect for the smallest details. Although not everything was victory or light, that chapter left an indelible mark on all of us. The battle is not over, nor near its end, but it taught us that tenacity, ethics, and commitment matter not only in a laboratory or an autopsy, but also in the memory and heart of those who fight for a fairer world. The buckle, that small object no one wanted to see at first, became the perfect metaphor for what our profession can represent. A relentless search for truth despite indifference, threat, or silence. I still think of that rural family. The same woman who showed me her husband's clothes, small and firm, pointing the buckle as if it were a symbol of resistance. Those moments have taught me that justice is not only a cold and technical process, but lives in emotions and experiences we share with those who entrust us with their stories. They remind us that behind every name, every report, and every piece of evidence, there are unique lives, and that the forensic commitment goes far beyond science to become a profoundly human act. And so, despite the complications, challenges, and darkness we faced, the certainty of the importance of our work was renewed every day. Because if I learned anything from that case, from the discovery of that buckle and everything that arose around it, it is that true justice is built slowly, with perseverance and the conviction that silenced voices deserve to be heard, respected, and defended. That small and silent buckle not only ensured we didn't lose our way in our investigation, but also taught us never to underestimate the power of a detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem. Now, looking ahead, I know this is not just a story to tell, but a tool to inspire those who are beginning, and to remind all who fight that no detail is small when people's dignity is at stake. Truth can appear in any form, any object, any story. And as forensic experts, we have a responsibility to discover and protect it, no matter how uncomfortable or dangerous it may be. That buckle I once embraced as evidence ended up being the light that illuminated a struggle, and I know that many more stories are waiting for the patience, ethics, and deep insight of others willing to find them. What came after that night seemed like something out of a movie, but it was a harsh reality of our daily struggle. Every breakthrough in the investigation triggered a chain reaction that challenged not only our patience, but also our ability to stand firm amid the chaos. We had to learn to live with uncertainty and latent danger. I remember one occasion, hours before presenting a key report, when one of the most important documents mysteriously disappeared from our office. It was neither forgetfulness nor a mistake. It was a message. But we did not stop. The buckle that started it all had awakened more than suspicions. We were facing an enemy operating in the shadows, using fear and manipulation to try to silence evidence. The nights in the laboratory became scenes of intense vigils. While some team members reviewed each file, page by page, looking for inconsistencies or new clues, others ensured there were no cracks in the chain of custody, aware that any failure could give weapons to those who wanted to discredit us. It was during those marathon sessions that human connection took on a deeper meaning. We supported each other, knowing that physical exhaustion was just another form of psychological pressure trying to wear down our will. The most delicate moments were when we faced ethical decisions that went beyond science. The evidence increasingly pointed firmly toward responsible parties with faces and names, people who, from their positions, manipulated rules and processes to protect themselves. It became a minefield where any misstep could cost us not only the investigation, but also the safety of many. Dilemmas arose that made us question to what extent silence, although politically convenient, became complicity. In the midst of that struggle, the memory of the buckle returned again and again, reminding us that our vocation is with the truth, no matter the consequences. It was then that an unexpected twist shook us from within. The revelation that one of our team members was collaborating with those who wanted to manipulate the results. Accepting that betrayal was not easy. That young man, full of potential and apparent ethics, had given in to pressures we had neither seen coming nor had perhaps underestimated. This hit us hard because trust is the foundation on which everything in this work rests. However, instead of breaking us, that experience strengthened us. We implemented stricter protocols and emotional support for the team, aware that combating corruption requires not only intelligence, but also a safe space where integrity can remain intact. In that atmosphere of tension and constant vigilance, another finding rekindled the flame of hope. by cross-referencing information with other investigations circulating discreetly in different states. We found patterns of similar use of those contaminating pesticides and suspicious movements in supply chains. That discovery was another drumbeat in our battle because it meant the problem was neither local nor isolated. It was a network affecting many communities beyond what we initially thought. That confirmation not only expanded the scope of our investigation, but also attracted greater resources and allies, including international organizations dedicated to environmental and human rights defense, who recognized the urgency of our cause. I especially remember a meeting with a group of scientists from different specialties who joined to analyze our data and offer new perspectives. It was an enriching but also exhausting encounter because we were not only debating numbers and graphs. We discussed lives, justice, and how to break historical chains of oppression and corruption. That multidisciplinary collaboration allowed us to strengthen our work even more, making it much harder for official versions to discredit the evidence we presented. Despite everything, the risk remained. External pressures continued, and at times were as subtle as intimidating, inviting reflection on the personal and professional consequences of continuing the investigation. But getting that far had taught us that the truth is more powerful when defended with conviction. Amid all that turmoil, there was a moment I will never forget. It was when I visited an affected community, the one that initially seemed like just a simple piece of the puzzle. The welcome was warm but loaded with accumulated pain. The wife of one of the deceased appeared with her husband's clothes, the ones with the intact buckle. She looked me straight in the eyes and, without a word, handed me the symbol of our struggle. At that moment, I understood that the buckle had ceased to be only a material object and had become the embodiment of the dignity of those families. We were facing an enemy who sought to deny their pain, but found in us an unbreakable barrier. That human connection became a profound reason to persist when everything seemed lost. Weeks later, we witnessed an event that seemed to change the course of our struggle. A carefully planned leak appeared in a national media outlet, with documents and testimonies that publicly reinforced what we had confirmed in private. It was no coincidence. Someone inside the networks we investigated decided to break the silence, perhaps motivated by the pressure of growing solidarity or by the internal ethics that never fully die, even in the darkest places. That disclosure had an immediate impact. Reactions were diverse, from desperate attempts to discredit the information to an awakening in political and social sectors that until then had remained indifferent or complicit. Justice, albeit slow, had found a crack through which to begin to seep. With that new momentum, we organized open seminars and informational sessions aimed at communities, activists, and health professionals, with the goal of empowering those on the front lines of the impact of those pesticides. That dissemination of knowledge was also a way to protect ourselves. Truth, once known and shared, became harder to silence. Even some media began to take an interest in deepening the story, and little by little we increased public pressure for judicial processes and regulatory reforms to begin. However, we knew the enemy behind it all was cunning, and that the battle was just beginning. The buckle remained as a silent reminder of the price that had to be paid to move forward. It was during that time that the attacks stopped being only institutional and became personal. Friends and colleagues received veiled threats, anonymous calls suggesting consequences if we did not stop. The tension grew to the point of being felt in the breath of every day. Deep down, that showed us that we were touching the core of a corrupt and dangerous system, but also revealed the unexpected solidarity that emerged amid that darkness. Communities came to us to offer their testimony and support. Professionals risked their positions out of ethics, and families, despite their pain, found in the struggle a reason to carry on. That network of strength was the true engine that kept us standing. One of the most memorable moments occurred when a young journalist, who had followed the case in the beginning, handed us a large archive of documents recovered thanks to her investigation. There was internal correspondence that clearly demonstrated the manipulation of results in the laboratories. That evidence was decisive for reigniting legal demands and urging the intervention of international organizations. No one could deny that behind the scenes there was an organized network to hide the truth and protect those responsible. It was as if the buckle, with its small yet firm symbol, had been opening invisible doors to let that unjust story finally come to light. However, With every shared victory came new obstacles, new attempts to divert attention or breathe life into narratives that sought to minimize the severity of the situation. The media battle required different forms of resistance. We learned to engage with the public, to build narratives that explain not only technical data, but the real consequences for people's lives. That was when our work gained dual value, scientific and human, because without empathy toward those who suffered, all evidence lost strength. The buckle, that small object no one thought would change the course of everything, became an emblem that united professionals, victims, and civil society in a single voice. There came a time when we understood that every report, analysis, and testimony had to be delivered with such robust certainty that no attempt at discrediting it could shake it. It was a meticulous and exhausting job, but also passionate. We knew that behind every name in the files was a story deserving justice, and that our work transcended science to also be an act of memory and dignity. Thus, the buckle, that seemingly modest piece, became the silent symbol of our mission, to uncover the truth so that, although late, justice could be served. Today I can say that case changed me forever. It showed me that forensic medicine is not just the science of bodies nor the record of death, but the key to open doors that have been denied for years. That the search for truth can be uncertain, dangerous, and exhausting, but also beautiful because it means rescuing voices and resisting silence. The buckle, which seemed like an insignificant piece, taught us to be patient, to be meticulous, and never to underestimate any detail, because within it may lie the key to confronting great injustices. That lesson is what I carry with me and hope to pass on to those willing to take on this work with an open heart and their eyes on the horizon. Sometimes I wonder what will happen to all the stories still waiting to be told, to the buckles, to those small details that seem to get lost over time, but actually hold the hidden truth. I know we will not be few to face those battles with the same passion and commitment, because our work, though silent, has a power beyond bodies. It is a voice of the forgotten, the resistance against impunity, and a tribute to human dignity. The buckle was just a beginning, a minimal symbol that hid a universe of truths. And I, as a forensic doctor, will continue searching among those silent details, knowing that each one can turn darkness into light and injustice into memory. As we progressed with the investigation, the atmosphere grew increasingly heavy, as if the very air was impregnated with an invisible tension that intensified with every meeting, every document review, every laboratory analysis. The buckle, that small object that had gone almost unnoticed, kept appearing like a constant echo in our minds and in the team's work. It had become a silent beacon, a sign that we were treading on dangerous ground, but also in the right place to seek justice. Every time we thought we had made a step forward, another obstacle emerged, not only in the form of missing documents or contacts shutting doors on us, but also as internal doubts, fatigue, and even personal fractures within the group. The stay of alert was constant. We knew the enemy operated not only in the shadows of corruption, but also in the volatility of human emotions. Threats began to materialize in anonymous messages and unexpected visits to some team members. At first, we tried to downplay them, convinced that fear was a tool to derail us, to make us abandon the path. But reality proved more complex and dangerous than we had imagined. The line separating professional from personal began to blur. Some lost entire nights of sleep. Others became distrustful, even toward those who seemed their closest allies. In those moments, the group's strength was tested not only in our scientific work, but in our humanity, the ability to support one another when the ghosts of fear and uncertainty struck hard. It was then that I understood forensic work rests not only on tangible evidence, but also on invisible courage that arises within each of us. The unexpected came when the evidence we consider most fragile and circumstantial, the buckle, began to reveal itself as a thread linking a much broader plot. Investigating its origin, we discovered that this particular model was only distributed in certain tightly controlled markets and was linked to suppliers who were also part of the network manipulating the pesticide distribution chain. That connection indicated the victim might have been exposed to more direct contacts with those contaminants than we had initially thought. But more than that, the buckle was a link between several cases that seemed isolated. It showed us we were facing a pattern of negligence and cover-up with regional reach. It was a tremendous blow because we began to see not only victims, but an entire web of complicity woven over years, where human lives seemed like dispensable pieces. In those days, with pressure at its peak, the team decided to conduct a clandestine visit to one of the places marked in the leaked documents. It was a dangerous excursion requiring discretion and speed. I remember the feeling of walking along little-traveled paths, adrenaline pumping, and a firm conviction that we held data that could change everything. Upon arrival, the conditions we witnessed confirmed our worst suspicions. Entire communities exposed to banned substances without any protection, without access to clear information. What we observed was a tangible evidence that the authorities and companies involved had allowed or even facilitated that situation. It was a slap in the face to our conscience, but also motivation to continue. Because in every face, in every anxious glance, we saw the urgency of our work. When we returned, the investigation gained new momentum. The soil and water samples we collected were processed in collaboration with foreign specialists, and the results, clear and forceful, confirmed the presence of contaminants at dangerous levels. As we drafted the report that would trigger a national debate, the sense of responsibility became more tangible than ever. We knew that document represented not only scientific work, but the voice of those who had long been ignored. Amid so many complications, something never ceased to shine. The team's commitment and the deep feeling that we were doing the right thing, even if the path was dark and narrow. The buckle, kept in a display case as a symbol of all we had lived through, reminded us that this tiny detail had been the key that opened the door to a silenced truth. But the battle, far from ending, grew even more intense. The strategies of those who aimed to extinguish the light we had kindled hardened. Attempts at discrediting became routine. Some of our publications were baselessly discredited, our sources questioned, and the scientific community even pressured to distance itself from our work. We suffered legal attacks meant to intimidate us, forcing us to seek support from international institutions. In moments like these, I realized the fight was not only against corruption or negligence. It was a battle for truth on a stage where economic and political power tried to control the narrative. Every word we delivered, every piece of evidence we presented, became a stone thrown against that wall of silence and lies. Despite everything, the buckle remained a silent reminder on my desk, a tangible symbol that even the smallest detail can challenge vast and complex structures. It's curious how such a modest object became the constant vigil of our convictions. It was not just a metal piece, but the manifestation of a human story, a testimony of pain and injustice, a call not to stop. On lonely nights, when fatigue and uncertainty overwhelmed me, I looked at the buckle and found it the strength to carry on. I remembered words I once shared with a colleague. In this work, details matter because within them lies the truth no one wants to accept. Time passed, and although justice advanced slowly, the ripple effects of that investigation extended beyond what was expected. What began with a buckle hidden on an old man's clothing ended up sparking a national debate on pesticide regulation, the protection of vulnerable communities, and the integrity of forensic scientific processes. In many ways, that buckle became a banner for those who decided not to let interest and corruption continue to dictate the fate of thousands. And although wounds still heal and battles continue, the path we walk reminded us that truth can be an uphill climb, but unbreakable when upheld by patience, respect, and conviction. Now, looking back, I sometimes wonder how many other buckles remain hidden in the shadows of other cases, waiting for someone to find them and reveal what seems unnoticed. I think of eyes that watch without being seen, of hands that hide and those that, with courage, decide to point. Because I know this story is not an isolated event, but an example of how forensic medicine can become an act of resistance and dignity. That in every investigation, no matter how small it seems, lies the possibility of changing the course of many lives. And it is that certainty that drives me to continue, to be attentive to those details invisible to others, because I know entire universes deserving to be told hide behind them. I want to believe that somewhere, someone today finds a buckle, a note, a lost letter that can transform history. I want to believe that person will understand, as we did, that in the search for truth, forces sometimes intervene that seem invincible, but that our obedience is not to fear, but to the deepest human commitment. That forensic work, far from being just the analysis of bodies and evidence, is the beacon that illuminates the path for those without a voice, that it is a silent fight that honors the memory of those unjustly gone and strengthens the conviction that, no matter how minimal the evidence, it can always be the spark that ignites change. Thus end my words, not with a definitive conclusion, but with an invitation to look more closely, to value every detail, not to fear the shadows that arise on the path, because that is often where truth hides. And above all, to remember that justice is not a destination, but a process where patience, ethics, and constant commitment are the most powerful tools. The buckle was only the beginning, but among those small forgotten pieces will always be found the strength needed to turn darkness into light, and, with it, pay tribute to human dignity.